had no idea there was a very brief fashion movement in the early 60s called optical art fashion. So I found these images. Some of them are more modern, but most of them are from the 60s. I thought, oh, that's really cool, a little dynamic, a little cool. And so I pitched this to Brad the next day, and we had, again, very little time, but Bryn actually took that, she loved the idea, she took it to the next level. She designed I think she designed every single outfit for Evelyn Dever in the film in the span of one day. She just stayed up, I think, 24 hours and did it, because she was so excited about the idea. So again, it's an idea that's there in the film. It's very much in the background. I'm hoping that whatever she was wearing was not going to give anything away about her relationship to the screenslaver, but it's definitely there. This is a drawing by Brad Bird. Have you ever done this? And you see these little shapes in your eyeballs? Well, we kept doing all this really cool stuff with the screenslaver hypnotic effect. And our graphic designer, Josh Holtzclaw, had probably done 20 or 30, and they're cool. They were all great. Brad was even liking them, but something wasn't quite right. So I said, could you draw what you see at all? You know, and I'm always reluctant to actually ask the director to do that, but Brad can draw, so it was cool. And he kept saying, it's like this, and I'm like, what can I get in your head? Can you draw it for me? So he actually drew this image. And that was what became the hypnotic effect. Josh took it and ran with it, and Bryn took it and ran with it. And this was the basis of Evelyn Dever's final costume in the film, as you can see. So, so I could actually say Brad designed that. It's cool. I'm going to talk a little bit about Inside Out. Inside Out was really difficult. I spent 5.5 years on this film, and it was a film where most of what I thought I knew about designing a film often eluded me. Directed by Pete Docter and Ronnie Del Carmen. Had a lot of challenges which were fun, frustrating, exhilarating, maddening. One thing I knew going in is that we had the contrast of the real world to the mind world. And this is a board my texture art director, Burt Berry, put together for this. So with the mind world textures, we thought it would be really great thinking of the mind, not the brain, but we kind of mixed them up a bit, was electrochemical. And so that word suggests electricity and color and liquid and all kinds of translucency, transblurency, a word we made up, and absorbing light and transmitting light. And that became the base, and saturation, that became the basis of the entire world, both for the characters and memories and everything in the world of the mind, versus the real world textures, which were hard surfaces, muted colors, hyper-textural and visually complex, and high key and low contrast. The reason that was because, again, like on the Axiom, more so than the Axiom, throughout the entire film, we were cutting back from the real world to the mind world and back and forth. So I needed the audience not to have to think about it. They had to know right away, oh, I'm in the mind world, oh, I'm in the real world, I'm in the mind world, I'm in the real world. And that unto itself was a challenge. Designing the real world was actually pretty straightforward for us, but I got lost in the details. There was a lot of story churn on the film. It was a simple idea, but very complicated to execute. As anything that happened in the real world, something had to change in the mind world. Anything that happened in the mind world might have affected the real world. So I would constantly have to change things, and it became so overwhelming. I found myself chasing details rather than keeping zoomed out to the big picture. So it was very difficult. What does the mind look like? We did a lot of research. We did a lot of research, and while we were determined to focus on designing the mind and not the brain, we found a lot of practical use in studying how the brain was created, and used much of what we learned to great effect. Things like where the shells memories are stored in the mind. The reason we folded them over is because the way your brain works is as it's folded, it allows the neurons to talk to each other in a much more close proximity, versus had it been stretched out, it would have to travel a lot further to provide information back and forth. But just as an idea, that gave us a conceit for how to design the shelves of memories in the mind. Let's see. There's a board we call rainbow board. So they inject chemicals into brains and then photograph them. So it kind of creates these cool images. Very inspiring. Getting our heads around the geography of the mind world was challenging. Mini maps plotting out what it might be and needed to tell the story we created. Here are only a handful. Believe me, this is like 1/3 of what we did. I'll just step through these kind of quickly. What is the mind? What does it look like? Where are we? How does it work? What regions are there? Okay, we have geometry, logic, music. I mean, it could be anything. And while that sounds exciting, and it is, you just need to start editing and limiting and what do you need to tell the story. And how do you suggest a bigger world there is than you actually need to build or can build. So. And we start honing in on it. And as you can imagine, solidifying what this all meant was incredibly difficult. I worked with a terrific art department that generated more artwork on any film that I worked on at Pixar, probably the most of any film at Pixar. Here are only a few of my early paintings exploring both the real world and the mind world very early on. I needed to do that because countless, so many ideas, but it also represents a moment of each one of these paintings represents a moment of the ever-changing aspect of the storytelling that needed to take place. So you can imagine by feeling the need to intuit myself through the process, I got lost in the process. But I truly do feel it was the only way to get this film done. But it did prevent me from zooming out again as much as I needed to kind of get my head around the bigger conceits of the visual language of the film. The far right image was one of the early concepts that I did, just, trying to throw stuff up to the director. Down at the bottom right, that was joy and sadness traveling to the Ig, which was through a thorn forest. At one point on the upper left, you can see it looks like a little bit of a theater. Riley actually went to visit her grandmother who passed away, who was a hoofer on Broadway in the 20s and 30s. The train of thought was a much bigger aspect of the film for a long time. Fell away. It's still in the film, but it fell away. The lower right image, that was where Riley lived in Brooklyn, but that's all she remembered was her building. She just imagined it being in a deep forest. That's all she could remember. But this was a lot. It was crazy. It was crazy. I did so many paintings trying to figure out what this film was. While it was very frustrating and time-consuming and all of these crazy things, I did get lost in it. However, I will say, and I know I'm out of time. I need to step through a few more quick things. These were some ideas I had for lighting, some of which did end up in the film, but I'll step through this fairly quickly. I had this idea that wherever sadness, any of the mind world characters went, the audience only saw what they needed. So I'd have Joy walking towards something and sitting down in a chair, and I would have it appear. And then maybe a table and a lamp appear. Oops, sorry. Let me back up. Sorry. And then, there we go. It's not finished, but you get the idea. I tried it with a painting by Balthazar, where it's not flashy or anything. I was just kind of get the idea to show something to the director as quickly as possible. This was the train of thought traveling through some of this world. We could have done much more cool things with the computer rather than just a flat painting. This is an early test kind of showing this concept that we wanted to use. Very simplified. Our DP of lighting, Kim White, and one of her co-workers, Michael Sparger, put this together. But we showed this to Pete, Doctor, and he did get excited, and it was really cool to see him get excited about something like that. And so we were able to use the idea that I had come up with in a very limited way, probably best for the film, I admit. Had we used it everywhere, it would have been too much. So here. I'm going to skip through this part. It kind of goes through the color script. You can see I didn't do strips, really. I had to do individual panels because when the story changed, I would have to move things around and adjust the color and the contrast constantly. Let's see how some of this worked. This is a real world component of some of this, and then we cut to the mind world. So you can see the contrast of the color and the values. The only thing that we were able to do, of course, was towards the end of the film unify the worlds by desaturating it as Riley became depressed and kind of unifying the worlds until they came back together at the very, very end of the film. Ultimately, for me, I'm going to step through this. I'm sorry. I need to step through this as well. Sorry. What this was about, seriously, was one of the most difficult choices we had to make in the film was what would be the sky color in the mind. I had done a whole series of these early paintings, and I couldn't figure out what we wanted. Pete Docter had this idea that depending on Riley's mood, the sky would change to that color. So if she was angry, it might be red. If she was sad, it might be blue. We were afraid it would look like Malibu lights spinning in her head. So we had very little time left, and I dragged the producer, Jonas Rivera, and Pete into the art room, and I said, you know what? I did all these little paintings. They weren't about the sky at all. They were about a lot of other things, but one thing that's in common is all the sky colors are in a very tight range, very neutral. And he said, well, they asked me why, and I said, I don't know. It was intuition. Ultimately, what I discovered is we have so much color on the ground with the characters and the memories that I needed something neutral for that to read against and look pleasant, and so that it didn't just become a cacophony of color and light. You know, so I said, I think this is the sky color, and they said, I think you're right. So we had a glass of champagne, and I went home. You know? It was crazy. I'll step through this quite quickly. But here you can see it in the final film. The only big change we made is toward the end of the film, let it get darker as Riley's trying to escape San Francisco and go home. Ultimately, I want to talk about how that film, getting my head around this project was really, really difficult. One world impacted the other, changes in both were constant, and changes in one could greatly affect the other. How the mind worked and what it looked like had to be created from an emotionally intuitive point of view, like the film in a way. The more I felt the need to organize it, the more I felt I had to trust my instincts about what felt right. In the end, the best thing that could happen did. It really became its own thing, walked away, and never looked back. I still don't know how to look at that film. I'm very proud of it. I'm proud of all the work everyone did on the film. I love the film, and I love that it was well received and did well in the world. But I still don't understand it. I really don't. I think maybe in 10 years, hopefully I will, and I'll get to appreciate it a little better. It was very difficult. In all of the things I talked about here, I'll tell you one thing I know does not work at all is this. Charting out how the audience should feel before you've experienced as a creator their journey from an emotional point of view, that doesn't work. It's an exercise in creating a world from the outside in. And it can lead to ideas being forced into a preformed box, rather than evolving in tandem with the characters and emotions. It can also, if adhered to explicitly, can inhibit surprise, positive change, or positive change that happens when a story is evolving and begins telling you what it needs to be, rather than what you want it to be. This is crazy to me. Designing from the outside in only works on the surface. It doesn't go any deeper than what you think you want at that moment. So you really got to go a little deeper than that. So kind of to wrap this up, character and world building, it's the big picture central visual conceits can transcend and unify disparate story and visual elements. The most effective design comes from intuition and emotion, but also from a place of deep learning, understanding, and research. Design from the inside out. Start with the character and work your way out. And then designing from the character's point of view or character point of view never, ever, ever fails if you really stay focused on that. So. One last thing, and I use this in every talk I get, it's one of my favorite quotes, is CGI, well, I'll get to that in a second. CGI has come a long way since I began working in the industry, in the early 90s. As artists back when we had to spell out everything in detail with drawings, we don't have to do that anymore today. I can rough out something and hand it off to someone and they take it to the next level on the computer. It's great. Production design in the age of CGI is exactly the same as it's been since the 1920s. Only the tools have changed. The role of providing those visual goals has not. The tools have evolved so that artists can achieve visual goals more quickly and interactively than before. But being clear about visual goals through design matters more now than ever. Let it be a tool, don't let it become a crutch. So I think that's very important. So, yeah, now I always think, now that technology has caught up with our imaginations, in other words, we can do anything, literally do anything. What next? What are we going to do next? For myself, I know it's kind of digging deeper into thinking about the big picture design part of the film. Knowing that we have so many skilled, talented artists who can kind of take that and run with it and make it even better. So it's exciting that I get to focus on that part of filmmaking rather than the small details, It's great. So that is my quote from my friend, Jason Deemer. I use this in every talk. It's pain is temporary, suck is forever. Digging a little deeper matters in the long run. If you need to make a change and it's going to make something better, not just different, but better, more clear, more understandable to an audience, it's worth it. Because it's going to be there for a long time. So pain is temporary, suck is forever. Quote by Jason Deemer. So sorry for going over, but I really felt that I needed to get that out of my system, so thank you very much.